I had memorized the numbers so completely they became like breathing. 10 years, 3 million in operating capital that came from my own severance package, and every dollar I didn't spend on myself. 247 employees who called me boss on the first Tuesday of every month when I walked the floor. 17 patents registered under my name. One corner office with the city view I'd promised myself when I was 23 and broke. The company was called Meridian Tech Solutions. We built custom enterprise software for healthcare networks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Mine. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, my father called me into his study. I remember the light was strange that day, gray and filtered through the heavy curtains he kept drawn most of the time. He sat behind his mahogany desk, the one he'd inherited from his father, who'd inherited it from someone else I'd never known. My mother was in the leather chair to his left. My sister Emma was standing by the window, and she wasn't looking at me. That should have told me everything. "We've made a decision about the future of Meridian," my father said. He set down his reading glasses and folded his hands. He had liver spots on his hands now that I'd never noticed before. When had he gotten old? "It's time for the company to pass into family hands more traditionally." I remember the word, traditionally, hung in the air like something toxic. "It is in family hands," I said. "Mine." My mother cleared her throat. That particular sound, I'd heard it 1,000 times when she disagreed with something but wanted someone else to say it first. "Emma has always wanted to be more involved in the business," she said carefully. Emma, who had a jewelry design degree from a college she'd chosen based on which one was closest to her boyfriend at the time. Emma, who had worked in a mall boutique for 3 months before deciding retail wasn't for her. Emma, who had never, not once, asked a single question about my business, my strategy, my vision, or my plans. "Involved how?" I asked. "As CEO," my father said. The room did something strange. The air got thick. The light from the window seemed to darken. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway outside. I could hear traffic 8 stories below us. "She'll report to a board," my mother added quickly, as if that made it better. "With oversight." "I've been the CEO for 8 years," I said. My voice sounded strange to me, calm and distant, like I was listening to someone else speak. "The company generates 42 million in annual revenue. I've tripled the client base since I took over. The growth projections for next year." "I know what you've done," my father interrupted. His voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been angry. "That's exactly why we know it will be fine in Emma's hands. You've built something that works. Emma can simply maintain what you've built." Maintain. As if building something was the same as keeping it running. As if the difference between growth and stagnation didn't matter. I looked at my sister. She was still looking out the window. "Emma," I said. She turned then. There was something in her expression I'd never seen before, not exactly confidence, but something close to it. The confidence that comes from knowing you're about to get something you didn't earn. "I'm sorry," she said, and she didn't sound sorry at all. "I talked to Mom and Dad about how you were always leaving me out of things, about how it felt like you didn't think I was capable of anything real. I thought about it a lot, and I realized I needed to do something for myself." "You've never worked a day in this company," I said. "I'm willing to learn," she said. She actually smiled. "And everyone knows you're going to help me. You're too invested in Meridian to let it fail just because you're not in charge anymore." She was right about that, and she knew I'd know she was right. I could see it in the way she held my gaze, in the small lift of her chin. I stood up. I didn't remember deciding to stand, but suddenly I was on my feet and everyone was looking at me. "When?" I asked. "We'll make the announcement at the shareholder meeting next month," my father said. "You'll transition Emma into the role over the next 6 months, then step down gracefully. You'll stay on in an advisory capacity, of course." An advisory capacity, a title with no authority, a seat at meetings where no one would listen to me. Slow, complete erasure of everything I'd built. "And if I don't?" I asked. There was a long pause. The clock ticked, The traffic hummed. "Then you'll breach your fiduciary duty to your family," my mother said quietly, "and will have no choice but to pursue legal action. The company is a family asset, regardless of who's currently running it, and our lawyers have made it quite clear that we own controlling shares of Meridian." They did. I'd given them those shares 10 years ago in the beginning, when I needed the capital injection to survive, and I'd actually believed that family meant something. That family meant they wouldn't do this. I walked out without saying anything else. That was the moment I should have fought. That was the moment everyone would have fought, screaming, crying, threatening lawyers of my own. But I didn't do any of those things. I walked down the hallway of my parents' apartment, past the photographs of our family arranged chronologically on the walls, past Emma's school pictures and Emma's graduation photos and Emma's engagement announcement. I walked past the absence of my own life displayed there. I went home to my apartment in the financial district. I poured a glass of wine that I didn't drink. I sat on my couch in the dark and I thought about 10 years. I thought about sleeping 3 hours a night during the launch phase. I thought about the investor meetings where I'd been the only woman in the room, and how I'd learned to speak slightly lower and never apologize for my ideas. I thought about the moment we landed our first major hospital contract, 30 beds, nothing compared to where we ended up, but it had felt like everything. I thought about Emma at family dinners, scrolling through her phone, not listening to me talk about architecture decisions and client retention rates. Emma asking when dinner would be ready. Emma asking if I could help her with her rent because she was between jobs. I'd helped her, twice. I'd written checks and never asked her to pay them back. The wine sat beside me, warming to room temperature. The city lights moved outside my window. The night got deeper and deeper until it was 3 in the morning and I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to fight them in court, not yet. I was going to understand them first. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had happened. I showered. I put on the gray suit I always wore on Tuesdays. I drove to the Meridian office in Midtown and I walked through the lobby like I owned the place, because I did, and nobody knew that was about to change. My assistant, Marcus, looked up from his desk. He was 26 and brilliant with code and had been with me since year 3 of the company. "Your 9:30 canceled," he said. "The Hartford people moved to next week. Also, there's someone waiting in your office." "Who?" I asked. "Your father's lawyer, Mr. Chen. He's been here since 8:30. I felt something settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, something colder than fear. "Thank you, Marcus. Hold my calls." My office was the corner space, 40 stories above the street, with windows on 2 sides. The city looked small from up here. Mr. Chen was sitting in the chair across from my desk, and he was reading through the drawer files like they belonged to him. He closed the drawer when he heard me come in. "Ms. Alexandra," he said, standing. He was maybe 60, with gray at his temples and the kind of suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Your father sent me to collect the company files. All patents, documentation, financial records, client contracts. Everything needs to be transferred to Emma's name and the family legal team." I closed the door. "That's not how this works," I said. I didn't move toward my desk. I stood by the window instead, looking down at the street. "The company is structured as an independent LLC. My name is on every major document as the founding principal. You can't just move files around." "Actually, we can," Mr. Chen said. He set a folder on my desk. It was thick, probably 30 pages. "Your parents retain controlling shares and decision-making authority. This is their legal right." I opened the folder. I read the first paragraph, then I read it again. Section 4.3 of the original operating agreement. I'd signed it. I'd forgotten I'd signed it. I'd been so focused on the business in those early days that the legal structure had felt like administrative noise. And I'd let my father's legal team handle it. I'd made a mistake, a terrible foundational mistake that meant my parents didn't just have leverage, they had ownership. "I need to consult with a lawyer," I said quietly. "Of course," Mr. Chen said, "but your parents wanted you to have this." He set another document on my desk. This one was thinner. It's a severance package. Very generous, actually. $3 million, paid over 3 years. And you'll retain 10% of company profits for the next decade. You should be quite comfortable. $3 million. The exact amount I'd invested to launch the company in the first place. He was being returned my own money like a refund on something I'd tried to buy. I need you to leave my office, I said. Mr. Chen nodded. He gathered his briefcase, and on his way out, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said, I tried to talk your father out of this. It's not the way I would have done it. Good to know, I said. I'll remember that when I call my lawyer. But I wouldn't call a lawyer. Not immediately. Not for the reason he thought. After he left, I locked my office door and I opened my computer. I pulled up the file system and I started to look at everything. Every email, every contract, every financial record, every personal note to myself about projections and strategies and my vision for Meridian over the next 5 years. I documented everything I could access. I took screenshots. I organized it all into encrypted folders that I would copy onto a USB drive I'd keep at home. Because I just realized something in that conversation with my father. In that moment, when my mother mentioned their lawyers and legal action. They were scared of me. That was the only reason to move this fast, to push me out before I could organize a defense. They were scared that if they gave me time, I'd take Meridian away from them somehow. I'd find a way. Which meant they'd already done something that they knew wouldn't hold up if I looked closely enough. I spent the next 8 hours at the office methodically copying files. I flagged every transaction my parents had made that I considered unusual. I noted every decision they'd overruled me on. I built a timeline of the moments they'd suggested I was getting too controlling, too ambitious, too willing to make hard decisions that affected my family's money. When I left the office that night, I had a complete picture of Meridian's history, and I had questions. Very specific questions about where the money went sometimes. Very specific questions about decisions that didn't make financial sense. Very specific questions about why my father had insisted on bringing in a particular accounting firm to do the annual audits, even though they were more expensive than our previous firm. I got home at midnight. I poured that wine that I'd left untouched the night before. It had gone bad. I dumped it out and poured a new glass, and I sat in the dark with my laptop and I started to research. My sister's engagement ring. I'd seen it at the last family dinner. I pulled up the jeweler's website. The ring was from there. I recognized it. It was listed at $45,000. Emma had mentioned once that my parents had bought it for her as an engagement gift. I looked at my parents' financial statements from that year. They'd claimed a significant charitable donation. $500,000 written off as a tax deduction. But when I dug deeper, when I looked at the financial documents I'd managed to copy, I found something interesting. That charitable donation had been made 3 days after a major contract payment came into Meridian. It had been made under a nonprofit that didn't appear to have any actual charitable activity. It was just a shell, a legal entity with no employees, no operations, no programs. It looked like money laundering. I sat back in my chair. The city lights moved below me. A siren went past, 8 stories down. My parents weren't trying to give Emma the company because they thought she was capable. They were trying to give her the company because they'd been using it to hide money, and they needed someone running it who would be compliant, who would do what they wanted without asking too many questions, who would be so grateful for the position that she wouldn't notice anything was wrong. Emma would be the perfect puppet. And I was the problem because I noticed everything. I was the problem because I couldn't be controlled. The announcement came 4 weeks later, exactly as scheduled. An email to all employees from my father's assistant explaining that Emma would be taking over as CEO, effective immediately, with myself stepping into an advisory role. The board meeting happened on a Thursday. The shareholder announcement went out that afternoon. The company I'd built in 10 years was no longer mine. I watched it happen from my new office, smaller, less prestigious, on the floor below my previous one. Marcus had cried when I told him I was stepping down. He understood what this meant for the company's direction. He understood that Emma had no idea what she was doing. But I didn't cry, not then. I came home to my apartment, and I closed all the curtains and I sat in the dark. And I felt the strange, hollow kind of calm that comes when you've finally accepted the worst thing that could happen. Except I didn't accept it. I was going to take everything from them. I just needed a plan. The first thing I did was hire a lawyer, but not to fight the company theft. Not yet. I hired a lawyer named David Reeves, who specialized in financial crimes and had a reputation for being meticulous to the point of obsession. I paid him out of my savings, and I sat across from him in his small office on the Lower East Side, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and he steepled his fingers. "What you're describing," he said slowly, "is a pattern of tax fraud and possible money laundering. It's serious, but it's also the kind of thing that needs documentation, real evidence, not spreadsheets and theories." "I have spreadsheets," I said, "and I have access to more. I'm still an advisory board member. I can see the current financials." "Are you supposed to see those?" he asked. "I have legitimate board access," I said. "That's not illegal." He nodded. "Then we do this carefully, very carefully. You document everything. You take only what you're entitled to see. You don't steal anything. You don't access any password-protected systems you're not supposed to be in. Because the moment you do something illegal, the moment you give them leverage, this all falls apart." "Understood," I said. "How long do you have?" he asked. "They're not in a rush," I said. "They think I'm going to roll over. They think I'm going to help transition the company and eventually disappear. They think I'm broken." "Are you?" he asked. I met his eyes. "No." "Good," he said. "Then here's what we do." Over the next 3 months, I became very, very quiet. I went to the office. I attended board meetings. I said hello to people in the hallway and asked about their families. I watched my sister make decisions that were financially irresponsible, and I didn't correct her. I watched the company's trajectory flatten and then start to decline, and I didn't say anything. I became the kind of person no one noticed. The kind of person who was always there but never really present. And while I was becoming invisible, I was collecting everything. I printed financial statements I had legitimate access to. I photographed documents that couldn't leave the building. I started to attend meetings where my father and the finance team discussed the strategic direction of Meridian's profits, and I listened to them talk about offshore accounts and trust structures that seemed designed to obscure the source of the money. At night, I met with David and we organized everything into a timeline, a narrative, a story that added up. "Here's what I think happened," David said one evening, spreading documents across his desk like a detective. "Your parents built the company through your work, right? They own controlling shares, so technically they're entitled to profit from it. But they wanted more. They wanted to move money through the company in ways that didn't show up on their personal taxes, so they created a nonprofit. They filtered corporate money through it. They took charitable deductions they weren't entitled to. And they'd keep doing it, indefinitely, as long as someone was running the company who wouldn't notice." "Emma wouldn't notice," I said. "Emma wouldn't notice," he confirmed. "But you did, and you were getting too difficult to control, so they moved her into your position." "What do I have that's actually evidence?" I asked. "Not theory, actual prosecutable evidence." He pointed at the financial statements. "These transactions, the timing is suspicious. The amounts are round numbers, which is unusual for legitimate business expenses. The nonprofit filing shows no actual charitable activity. And more importantly," he pulled out another document, "the accounting firm they insisted on using, I had an investigator look into them. They've been involved in 3 other tax fraud cases." "Can you use any of this?" I asked. "I can use all of it," he said. "But we need more. We need something that directly connects your parents' names to the fraud, not just the company structure. We need them." "What kind of something?" He leaned back. A conversation, a recording, something where they acknowledge what they're doing, or a documentary trace that's so clear even a jury of retired accountants couldn't miss it. That meant going deeper. That meant accessing systems I technically had a right to be in, but that my parents definitely didn't want me looking at. It meant risk. When? I asked. Whenever you're ready, David said. Just understand what you're doing. Once we file anything, once we go to the authorities, your family is finished. Your parents could go to prison. Your sister will almost certainly lose the company. Everything shatters. It's already shattered, I said. I'm just going to sweep up the pieces. I started with my father's email. I had legitimate access to his corporate email as a board member. I'd never used it before. I'd never looked at his personal communications. But now I opened the folder and I started to read. At first it was just administrative noise, board approvals, budget discussions, confirmations of meetings with accountants and lawyers. But about 6 weeks in, I found what I was looking for. An email chain from 7 years ago between my father and the accounting firm. In it, my father explicitly asked about structuring payments through the nonprofit in a way that maintains plausible deniability. The accountant's response used words like risk mitigation and strategic ambiguity. It was as close to an admission as I could hope for without a recording. I printed it. I dated it. I filed it away in the folder David had given me, a folder locked in a safe deposit box under a name that wasn't mine. I kept looking. I found more conversations about legacy planning, which seemed to involve moving company money into trusts that would eventually benefit Emma. Discussions about tax efficiency strategies that appeared to involve the nonprofit again and again. A fascinating email where my father explained to an advisor that he'd initially tried to keep me out of the financial details of Meridian because he was worried I was too principled about tax policy and might object to certain decisions. Too principled. I kept rereading that line. Too principled to be complicit. Too principled to understand that this was how rich people operated. Too principled to get it. What they meant was too honest. 3 months in, I had 40 pages of documented evidence. But I still didn't have the conversation David wanted, the moment where they explicitly acknowledged the fraud. So I orchestrated one. I called my mother and I asked if I could come by for lunch, just the two of us. She sounded surprised but pleased, probably relieved that I wasn't still angry, that I was moving on, that I was going to be normal about all this. I went to their apartment on a Tuesday, the same day Mr. Chen had come to collect my company files. My mother had arranged lunch on the terrace. It was April by then, and the weather was beautiful, the kind of day that made the city look like it was designed to make you happy. "You look good," my mother said, serving me salad. "I was worried about you for a while, after the announcement, but you seem like you're adjusting well." "I am," I said. It was true, I was adjusting, just not in the way she thought. "I wanted to talk to you about something, actually." "Of course," she said. She smiled at me with the particular kind of smile mothers use when they think you're finally going to validate their decision. "I've been thinking about Emma," I said, "and the company, and I want to make sure she's set up for success. I'd hate to see everything fall apart." My mother's expression softened. "That's very generous of you." "I need to understand something, though," I said. I reached into my bag. I had a folder. Not the real evidence folder, a decoy I'd prepared. Empty, really, but with one document inside, the email about plausible deniability. "I found this in the corporate files. I need to know what's happening." My mother looked at the email. Her face went very still. "Where did you get this?" she asked, and her voice had changed. It had lost the warmth. "It was in my father's email," I said. I was wearing a recording device. It was small and sophisticated, and David had helped me set it up. The battery would last 4 hours. "I'm trying to understand what this means. I need you to explain it to me." My mother set down her fork. She set down her napkin. She looked at me across the table, and I could see her mind working. I could see her trying to calculate whether I was a threat. "Your father was being paranoid," she said carefully. "About tax policy, Some accountants can be overzealous with these things. It's not. There's nothing actually improper happening. It says plausible deniability, I pointed out. That's not a phrase people use about legitimate business practices. You've been spending too much time on this, my mother said. She reached for my hand. You need to let it go. You need to move forward. Hanging on to anger about the company isn't going to help you. I didn't move my hand away, but I didn't let her hold it either. What if I need to understand it for legal reasons? I asked. Her hand stiffened. Legal reasons. Let's say I'm advising someone, I said. Someone who's interested in whether Meridian's financial structure is sound. How would you describe these transactions? We're done with this conversation, my mother said. She stood up. I think you should go. Mom, I said. Go, she said. I went. But I had the recording. When I played it back for David, he listened with the kind of focus that lawyers get when they're hearing something important. It's not quite an admission, he said when it was finished, but it's evidence of consciousness of guilt. Combined with the emails, it's compelling. And the way she shut down the conversation when you pressed her, that tells me they know exactly how bad this looks. So what do? I asked. David set down his pen. He looked at me across his desk, and his expression was serious. We decide if this is what you actually want, he said. Because once we file a report with the tax authorities, once we go to the IRS with this, there's no taking it back. Your parents' lives will be destroyed. Your sister will probably have to resign from Meridian. Your relationship with your family will be over, not suspended, not damaged, over. I'd known this was coming. I'd known the cost of what I was doing, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a different way. They destroyed my life, I said. They took the thing I spent 10 years building and they handed it to someone who doesn't appreciate it, someone who will let it rot. They did that deliberately. They did it because I was inconvenient. I know, David said. So yes, I said. Yes, I want to file a report. He nodded. Then let's make sure we do this right. The next 4 weeks were a blur of careful documentation. David hired a forensic accountant to review Meridian's financial records and validate the pattern of suspicious transactions. I provided access to everything I could legitimately see. We built what's called a prima facie case, legal language for a situation where the evidence is strong enough that a reasonable person would conclude the defendant is guilty. In this case, the defendants were my parents. The filing went to the IRS on a Wednesday afternoon in May. I was at work when it happened. I was sitting in my small advisory office, pretending to review market data, when my phone started to buzz. The first call was from my father. I didn't answer. The second was from my mother. I didn't answer that either. The third was from Emma. Her voice on my voicemail was panicked. What did you do? The IRS just showed up with investigators. What is happening? I deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest. I waited until 5 p.m. Then I gathered my things and I walked out of Meridian for the last time. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't leave a note. I just walked out and I got in my car and I drove home. My phone was ringing constantly by the time I got to my apartment. Calls from my parents, from Emma, from my father's lawyer. Text messages from my mother asking me to call her back, saying this was a misunderstanding, saying we could fix this if I just talked to them. I turned off my phone. I ordered dinner from the Thai restaurant I loved. I opened a bottle of wine, a good one, not the cheap stuff. And I sat on my couch and I watched the city lights come on, neighborhood by neighborhood, and I felt something settle inside me that had been restless for months. Not happiness, exactly, but peace. The kind of peace that comes when you've made a decision and you've seen it through and there's no more doubt. The legal process took months. My parents hired the most expensive lawyers in the state. They fought the investigation tooth and nail. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that Emma's hearing had nothing to do with the financial structure, that the nonprofit was a legitimate charity that just happened to be inefficient. The IRS didn't believe them. By September, federal charges were filed: tax evasion, conspiracy, money laundering through the nonprofit, The newspapers covered it extensively. "Manhattan Tech CEO's parents charged with fraud," the headlines read. "Multi-million-dollar tax scheme uncovered." No one mentioned that I'd been the one who exposed it. The story that the newspapers printed was that the IRS had discovered the scheme through routine audit procedures. That was technically true. I'd gone through official channels. I hadn't leaked anything to the press. But everyone in my family knew what I'd done. The criminal trial was scheduled for March of the following year. But before it got there was a deposition. This was where my parents' lawyers would be able to question me under oath about how I'd obtained the evidence, where they'd try to find weaknesses in the case, where they'd see me in person and try to intimidate me into backing down. I wore the gray suit, the one I always wore on important days. I came early, and I sat in a small conference room with David and a court stenographer, and I waited for my parents' lawyer to come. It was Mr. Chen. He looked tired, older than he had 6 months ago. He set down his briefcase and he sat across from me, and he looked like he wanted to say something that wasn't related to depositions. But he didn't. He opened his briefcase and he began to ask me questions. "Ms. Alexandra, did you access your father's email without permission?" "I accessed my father's corporate email using the credentials provided to me as a board member," I said. "I had legitimate access." "Did you record your mother without her knowledge?" "Yes," I said, "in a state where all-party consent to recordings is not required." "Did you intend to harm your parents when you filed a report with the IRS?" David objected. The question was asking about my intent rather than facts, and Mr. Chen rephrased. But we both knew what he was really asking. Did I set out to destroy them? Yes, I had. The deposition lasted 6 hours. By the end, I was exhausted and Mr. Chen looked defeated. "Off the record," he said, after the stenographer packed up her equipment, "I tried to talk them out of this, the whole thing. I told your father that if he kept the company running properly, you never would have noticed the offshore structure. I told him to just let you keep it. I told him it would end like this." "I know," I said. "You told him at the beginning, he didn't listen." "No," Mr. Chen said, "he didn't." He gathered his briefcase. At the door, he paused. "I'm going to recommend that they take a plea deal," he said. "If it's any comfort to you, they're going to lose everything anyway. The penalties, the restitution, the legal fees, they'll be bankrupt within a year. Your mother is already talking about selling the apartment." I thought about that. I thought about my parents selling the apartment where they'd humiliated me, where my father had sat behind his mahogany desk and taken away the thing I'd built. It should have felt like victory. But all I felt was tired. They did take a plea deal. My father pleaded guilty to tax evasion and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 40 months in federal prison. My mother got 30 months for her role in the scheme. They paid back taxes with penalties that totaled $8 million. The nonprofit was shut down. Emma, who hadn't actually known about any of the financial maneuvering, was allowed to step down from her position at Meridian without criminal charges. But the damage to her reputation was significant. She moved to California to live with her fiancé. I heard through mutual friends that she was working as a jewelry designer again. The new CEO of Meridian was someone my father had wanted to hire years ago, someone I'd blocked because I didn't think he'd be good for the company's culture. Turns out I was right about that. He cut salaries across the board to increase his own compensation, and the company started losing talented people. Within 2 years of my parents' conviction, Meridian's value had dropped by half. But it wasn't mine to save anymore, so I didn't. 6 months after my father's sentencing, I did something I hadn't done since the day they told me Emma was taking over. I smiled. I was at a networking event. Lawyers, accountants, business people who dealt with complex financial situations. Someone had told me I should come, that it would be good for my consulting business, which had taken off unexpectedly after the whole situation became public knowledge. Turns out that people want to hire the woman who caught her parents' multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. And I was talking to a venture capitalist about a new software company that was looking for funding. And he was explaining his concerns about the team's ability to scale. And I was explaining why his concerns were valid but fixable. And suddenly I was smiling because I realized I was talking about building something. Not from the ashes of my old company. Something new. Something mine. The last time I saw my mother was at her parole hearing. I wasn't there by choice. I was subpoenaed to answer questions about my knowledge of her criminal activity. She looked small sitting in that courtroom chair, smaller than I remembered her. She looked at me when I walked in and I watched her face crumple, like she was seeing me for the first time and understanding what her daughter had become. Someone cold enough to put her in prison. The hearing lasted 2 hours. When it was over, she was denied early release. She would serve her full 30 months. As I was leaving the courthouse, a photographer tried to take my picture. I'd gotten good at walking past photographers. I didn't look at him. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking, moving forward, not looking back. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A text from David. New case. Interesting one. Pension fund fraud, interested in consulting. I looked at the message. I thought about my mother sitting in that courtroom. I thought about my father in federal prison. I thought about Emma in California with her jewelry and her fiancé and her small, uncomplicated life. I thought about the 10 years I'd spent building Meridian. The nights I'd worked until 3 in the morning. The dreams I'd had about expanding internationally, about going public, about building something that would change how healthcare companies operated. That dream was gone. But I was still here, still capable, still hungry. I texted back, "Yes, tell me everything." And I drove back to my apartment, not to mourn the company I'd lost, but to figure out how to build the next one. Not from my family's money. From my own rage and their stupidity, and the clarity that came from finally understanding that I'd never needed them at all. I'd just needed myself. And now they'd given me permission to stop pretending I didn't know that.